Good. So thank you, Bill Seidelman, for this friendly introduction, and good morning to every one of you. Thank you for the opportunity to speak to you here today, especially, of course, the organizers of this great event. The subject of my presentation, as you've mentioned, is the exploitation of Nazi victims by anatomical institutes in Austria during and after the Second World War. Specifically, I will address the situation in Innsbruck and Graz. This is the two lesser medical schools in Austria, so to speak, after the Vienna medical school, which is much better known. But before I get to these two cities, I will have to make some remarks on Vienna as well. In the mid-1990s, as some of you might know and some of you know very well, there was an affair concerning the Viennese anatomist Eduard Pernkopf that garnered international attention at the time. At this time, the University of Vienna came under increasing international pressure concerning Pernkopf's possible use of Nazi victims for his then very widely read and used anatomical atlas. There was the suspicion that he had been using Nazi victims specifically for the models or the specimens that were depicted in the atlas. One of the personalities who ultimately succeeded in pushing the University of Vienna towards action, because it took a lot of external and international pressure, was Bill Seidelman, and so I'm very happy about this coincidence, which is not a mere coincidence, of course, that you're chairing this session today, and I'm very much looking forward to your comments. As a consequence of this whole affair, the Vienna University instituted a commission, a historians' commission, to investigate, and the wise decision at the time was not to limit this investigation to the anatomical institute, but to look into the use of medical specimens of all clinics and departments of the university. Margit Berner is also here today, was also part of this team at the time, so she's also very well informed, of course, of the details of this work. The results of the so-called Pernkopf Commission were presented in 1998 under the title Investigations of Anatomical Science in Vienna, 1938 to 1945. It's a very thorough report. Many interesting chapters were detailed. Unfortunately, it was never really published. The university produced a few copies, and it's very hard to get by today. But it's out there. You can find it if you're really determined to find it. The main finding of the commission was that the bodies of at least 1,377 people who had been executed in Vienna during the war for various reasons, during the Nazi regime, were transported after their death to the Anatomical Institute for dissection.
All Jews?
No, a minority of them Jews. Many of them were political prisoners, others were also what we would call common criminals, and many others were victims of what you could call the excess justice system at the time. An unknown number among these had been used for Pernkopf's atlas during the war, and also can't be out of time yet. It's humanly impossible. Regarding the Anatomical Institute, but I will speed up a bit. In Innsbruck and Graz, it's interesting to note that at the time they escaped scrutiny. There were some questions asked to them, letters. They evaded somehow the critical questions, and they managed to escape altogether, to somehow duck the bullet, so to speak. In my case, it was a happy coincidence that motivated me to take up this topic nearly 20 years later, after this affair. I was doing research on a related but also different topic on the post-war period in Vienna, in the archives of the French Foreign Service, actually in La Courneuve, near Paris. And I came across a file concerning the Innsbruck anatomy, which caught my attention. I don't know if it's really legible, but this is the file I found. And as it turns out, the French occupational authorities in Tyrol had launched an investigation in 1947-48 into the procurement of dead bodies for the institute in Innsbruck. They suspected at the time that Allied citizens had been used for dissection, which would have constituted a war crime under the Geneva Convention. So it was at the time considered a rather serious affair. And based on the files from this French investigation, I could start piecing together what happened during the war. The Innsbruck Anatomical Institute, as it turns out, together with the institutes of Munich, Erlangen and Würzburg, had received authorization from the Reichsjustice Ministry to take over bodies from prisoners executed at München-Stadelheim, which was the main prison and the main execution site in the southern part of Germany. And this meant that out of approximately 1,035 executions that were carried out there during the war at Stadelheim, a total of 60, it was only a small proportion that they received, were transported to Innsbruck for conservation and dissection. At this point on most of the people, of the victims who were dissected in Innsbruck, we have only very limited information. But I would like to give you one example of one personality to show you who these victims were and how they ended up on the dissection table. This example is Josef Reichenberg. I found his files in the documentation center, which was kind of handy. Politically, he belonged to the conservative Christian social camp before the war. But under the impression of the war against the Soviet Union, and I found this quite interesting, where he had two sons at the front, he was very afraid for them, very worried. He moved closer to the communist underground in Salzburg, and he wrote several leaflets calling for an end to the war. He was also thinking about various methods of armed resistance, how to destroy fuel trains and things like that. But he was, as happened to many members of the resistance in Austria, caught very quickly in 1942 already. The Gestapo in Salzburg arrested him. This picture was taken at his arrest. And in May 1943, he was executed in Munich for high treason. Under the provision that I've mentioned of the Reichsjustice Ministry, his body was transported to Innsbruck and used there for dissection courses until 1949. So this was rather seamlessly practiced. It continued seamlessly into the post-war. This despite the investigation of the French authorities, this didn't change much to this practice. In some cases, the extraordinarily precise documentation in Innsbruck shows that body parts of Nazi victims were used in the dissection course until 1957. We also know that the bodies of at least 7 Jewish people ended up at the Innsbruck Anatomical Institute. 5 of them were members of the Jewish community of Tyrol who had committed suicide under the impression, I suppose under the impression of the increasing persecution under Nazism. And 1 more person had died on a transport towards Auschwitz. She died on the train and was also transported to the Anatomical Institute. But this is something where clearly more research is being needed to find out more about these people. In addition to the cases I've already mentioned, so bodies from executed people, Munich and the Jewish people from Tyrol itself, the French authorities also found out that Innsbruck procured bodies from prisoner of war camps, from various camps in Austria. Here's the list, which you won't be able to read, but I can tell you it contains the names of 39 persons, or at least 39 cases, some of them with names, many more of them unknowns, or the names are not mentioned. Even at the time, 47-48, it was not possible to find out the names. Anonymization is, of course, a problem in this whole research context of anatomy. If we now go to the Institute in Graz, I have to say that anonymization was the rule. Between 1943 and 1945, Graz had its own execution site. It was instated there relatively late in 1943, and the victims were also decapitated there by a guillotine. And at the beginning of only at the beginning of this practice, the so-called cadaver assistant or Leichendiener still noted the full names in his register. This is the extract from his register, and what you can see here are 7 names among the very first people to be executed in Graz, and they were basically all members of the left-wing anti-Nazi movement in Graz, mostly associated to the illegal Communist Party. I have one more life story, but I'm going to skip this one because I feel I'm kind of pressed for time.
Well, you're doing fine.
Yeah, but I am only on...
That alarm went off was actually for Margit.
No, I get it. Okay, so I can...
Margit gave us the break.
She's not giving me a break. What does it mean? Still, I think it's... well, to quickly, Line Serfetz, who was executed in 1943 as well. She was one of 86 execution victims whose bodies were transported to the Graz Anatomical Institute. So Innsbruck is one thing. They procured the bodies from Munich, as I said. Graz had its own execution site, and a high proportion of all the people executed there, prisoners executed there, the total number 86, ended up in the Graz Institute. Between 1942 and 44, the anatomy in Graz also received a total of 71 bodies from the psychiatric hospital am Steinhof. This moves us also closer to the field of medicine. 71 persons, 17 of which were children. This fact is significant because many patients at the Feldhof hospital died due to the euthanasia killing programs during the war. Some were directly poisoned by hospital doctors, others died by systematic starvation. Lack of care, also willful neglect. It is very well documented in the case of Graz Feldhof, but also other psychiatric hospitals, of course. Feldhof was also designated as a killing facility for children in the framework of the Children's Euthanasia Program, comparable to the much better known children's killing facility at Spiegelgrund in Vienna. We don't know enough about Feldhof. There's no comprehensive study on the history of this hospital during the war, but we do know that it was a central place of euthanasia killings, just like other infamous hospitals in Austria and Germany. The leading figure in Graz anatomy during the war was Anton Haffall, so he was ultimately responsible for these practices. He headed the institute from 1933 to 1959, practically without interruption. He joined the Nazi Party in May 1938, which made him not an early adopter of Nazism, but he quickly decided to join the Nazis. And in November, he became the dean of the medical faculty, also an indicator that he enjoyed the confidence of the Nazi establishment. His fame as an anatomist up to this day rests on his textbook of topographical anatomy, which was first published in 1953. And many of the illustrations for this textbook were produced in the immediate post-war period, when the Graz Institute was awash with bodies from Nazi victims. To give you one example, in 1944, this marks the peak, Nazi victims constituted more than 90% of the Institute's supply of usable bodies. So there are obvious parallels with the Prankow case, the only difference being that the number of cases overall is smaller, and that nobody really has looked into it so far. Another significant aspect of the Graz medical faculty during National Socialism is the close cooperation between the Graz Medical School and the SS Medical Academy, an institution you have probably heard about. It was situated in this building where it was moved from Berlin in the year 1940, Rosenberggürtel 12, in very close proximity to the university. Until 1940, it was a home for the deaf-mute. I've been trying to find out what happened to the inhabitants or residents of this home. Before 1940, there's practically nothing known about it. It's just one more example of how much is left to be done on the history of medicine and medical care in Austria. The document on the right is an examination card of a student of the SS Medical Academy for the dissection course held at Graz University. This shows that the SS students received their medical training at the faculty, intermingled with the regular medical students. And it also shows that in this particular case, the future medical elite of the Nazi Reich was trained on the dead bodies of the executed political opponents of the regime. The SS Medical Academy also used concentration camps for training. Students traveled to Buchenwald, where they performed unnecessary surgeries, killing many hundreds of prisoners. For Mauthausen and Gusen, the twin concentration camps in Austria, the academy procured human specimens. Here's one famous picture of a collection of human specimens found at Gusen in 1945. One also famous case in this context is that of Professor Alexander Katan, who was an inmate in Mauthausen, a Dutch Jew, who was killed in 1943 for the specific purpose of examining his remains. And his skeleton was then transferred to Graz. There's proof that it was transferred to the SS Medical Academy, but it has not been possible up to this day to establish where it ended up or where the remains are. Here's the letter from the SS chief physician, Dr. Krebsbach, at Mauthausen concentration camp to the Graz SS Academy regarding the delivery of Alexander Katan's remains. Other than the specific case, the Medical Academy is likely to have received from Gusen concentration camp hundreds of anatomical and also pathological specimens, which also points to the fact that the SS Academy is an institution about which we know very little. It was a unique institution in the Third Reich, the only one of its kind, yet there's no significant study on it up to this day. We really don't know much what was going on there, apart from isolated facts like this one. Regarding the use of human remains of Nazi victims in Graz, it is also important to note that the issue has been publicly raised before, so there would have been opportunities for the medical school to take this up or to come clear with the past. In 1991, so a few years before the Pernkopf affair even, a regional newspaper published this article. Sorry, this is with the title "Nazi Victims as Study Objects," and triggered some public debate at the time. Some student newspapers took it up. There was a limited debate. But unfortunately, the head of the department at the time, a known right-wing activist, we also have to say, was simply not willing to engage in any kind of debate. He managed to deflect the whole issue. And when the Pernkopf affair broke in Vienna just a few years later, it means that many people in Graz must still have been aware of this affair, but nevertheless, nothing really happened. Some letters were exchanged, but as happened in Innsbruck, Graz dodged the whole affair, which means that another early chance of coming clear with the past was clearly missed. It remains to be seen how the two medical schools react now that these issues are again to a certain extent publicly known, and I would consider it one of the last chances to do something about this. But this is still very much open. There were some news reports on this a few weeks ago, and I'm still waiting to hear from them somehow. Many thanks for your attention.